December 16, 1944. The Ardennes forest. Snow fell in thick, silent curtains across the Belgian frontier, muffling the world beneath a blanket of white so complete that even the breath of the pines seemed to freeze before it could rise. In the pre-dawn darkness, a German grenadier named Klaus Becker crouched in a foxhole carved into the frozen earth, his fingers numb around the stock of his Kar 98K rifle. He had been told that the Americans were soft, that their soldiers preferred hot meals and warm beds to the crucible of combat, that their equipment was mass-produced junk held together by industrial arrogance rather than engineering precision. He had been told that the tide was turning, that the Führer's promised miracle weapons would sweep the Allies back into the sea. But as the first pale light touched the horizon and the forest around him erupted in a sound he had never heard before, a mechanical snarl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, Klaus Becker realized that everything he had been told was a lie. The sound grew louder, a high-pitched mechanical scream punctuated by the staccato bark of automatic weapons fire. Then he saw it, bursting through the tree line at a speed that seemed impossible for something so heavily armed. A low-slung vehicle painted in olive drab came hurtling across the snow. It was smaller than a half-track, faster than any armored car he had seen, and bristling with weaponry that seemed absurdly disproportionate to its frame. A heavy machine gun dominated the front, its barrel already glowing faintly in the cold air from sustained fire. Mounted alongside it were what appeared to be multiple automatic weapons, all firing in synchronized fury. The vehicle didn't stop, didn't slow, didn't seek cover. It simply appeared, unleashed hell, and vanished into the forest before the Wehrmacht soldiers could even properly acquire it as a target. Klaus pressed himself deeper into his foxhole, his heart hammering against his ribs, and whispered a prayer to a god he was no longer certain was listening. The Americans had brought something new to the battlefield, something his superiors had never warned him about, something that defied every assumption about American military doctrine he had been taught to believe. They called it many things: the gun motor carriage, the tank destroyer, the mechanized cavalry platform. But the German soldiers who survived encounters with it had a different name, one whispered in bunkers and field hospitals from the Siegfried Line to the Rhine. They called it the Eisenwasp, the Iron Wasp. The vehicle that haunted Klaus Becker's nightmares and those of thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers like him was officially designated the M8 Greyhound armored car, though this designation hardly captured the psychological impact it had on German forces. But the true terror came from variations and modifications that transformed lightweight reconnaissance vehicles into mobile weapons platforms that combined the speed of cavalry with the firepower of static gun emplacements. The concept was quintessentially American in its approach. Take a fast, maneuverable chassis, strip away everything that didn't contribute to lethality or mobility, and arm it with enough firepower to punch far above its weight class. The result was a class of vehicles that defied traditional military categorization, existing in a gray zone between reconnaissance, assault, and tank destroyer roles. These vehicles represented a fundamental reimagining of mechanized warfare, one that prioritized speed and overwhelming firepower over armor protection, a philosophy that German military doctrine, with its emphasis on heavy tanks and methodical combined arms operations, was fundamentally unprepared to counter. The genesis of this weapon system lay not in the grand strategic planning of generals, but in the practical problems faced by American forces in the fluid, fast-moving campaigns that characterized warfare in Western Europe after the breakout from Normandy. Traditional tanks, while powerful, were slow and consumed fuel at prodigious rates. Infantry, no matter how well trained, couldn't keep pace with the rapid advances that characterized American operational doctrine. What was needed was something that could move at highway speeds, traverse rough terrain, carry enough firepower to engage hardened targets, and do all of this with a small enough crew and logistical footprint that it could be deployed in large numbers. The solution came through field modifications and tactical innovations that transformed existing vehicles into something new, something that didn't exist in any army's pre-war doctrine manuals. The base platform was often the M8 Greyhound, a six-wheeled armored car originally designed for reconnaissance. Powered by a Hercules JXD inline-six engine, producing 110 horsepower, the standard M8 could reach speeds of 55 miles per hour on roads and maintain 30 miles per hour cross-country. It was lightly armored, with hull protection ranging from only a quarter-inch to a half-inch of steel plate, enough to stop rifle fire and shrapnel, but utterly inadequate against anti-tank weapons or even heavy machine guns at close range. The standard armament was a 37mm M6 gun in an open-topped turret, supplemented by a 50 caliber Browning M2 machine gun and a 30 caliber machine gun for the co-driver. On paper, it was a reconnaissance vehicle meant to probe enemy positions and report back, not to engage in sustained combat. But American ingenuity, particularly at the unit level, where combat veterans and enterprising mechanics worked together, transformed the M8 into something far more lethal. Field modification shops, often operating just behind the front lines, began experimenting with different armament configurations. Some crews removed the 37mm gun entirely, replacing it with multiple 50 caliber machine guns that could be trained independently, creating a mobile platform capable of saturating a target area with heavy automatic weapons fire. Others mounted captured German weapons, MG-42 machine guns, Panzerschreck anti-tank rockets, even the occasional Panzerfaust launcher, creating hybrid weapon systems that combined American mobility with German firepower. The most extreme modifications involved mounting 75mm pack howitzers, or even cut down 105mm guns on reinforced chassis, creating vehicle that could deliver artillery-level firepower while moving at speeds that made them almost impossible to target effectively. The tactical doctrine that emerged around these modified vehicles was equally innovative. Rather than operating as traditional reconnaissance elements that avoided contact, these iron wasps were employed as mobile fire support platforms that would race ahead of advancing infantry, suppress enemy positions with overwhelming firepower, and then disengage before the enemy could organize an effective response. They operated in pairs or small groups, using their speed to create multiple threat vectors simultaneously, forcing German defenders to split their attention and their fire. A typical engagement might last only 60 to 90 seconds, long enough for the vehicles to empty their magazines into a target, but not long enough for German anti-tank teams to set up and acquire proper firing solutions. Then, before return fire could become effective, the vehicles would simply accelerate away, their engines screaming, disappearing into terrain features or behind friendly lines, only to reappear minutes later at a completely different position. For German soldiers, particularly those who had grown accustomed to the methodical, predictable nature of set-piece battles on the Eastern Front or the static warfare of Italy, these tactics were psychologically devastating. Traditional defensive doctrine relied on creating hardened positions with overlapping fields of fire, on forcing attackers to approach across kill zones where German artillery and machine guns could exact maximum casualties. But the iron wasps didn't approach, they appeared. They didn't assault positions, they materialized, delivered a catastrophic volume of fire, and vanished. There was no pattern to predict, no approach route to defend, no moment when German gunners could confidently say, "Now we have them in our sights." Every engagement became a fleeting nightmare, and the cumulative psychological effect was corrosive to unit cohesion and morale. Klaus Becker, the young grenadier in the Ardennes, survived that first encounter with an iron Wasp, but it fundamentally altered his perception of the enemy he faced. He had been raised on propaganda that portrayed Americans as materialistic weaklings, as soldiers who would break and run at the first sign of serious resistance. The Americans he had been taught to expect would advance cautiously, would rely on overwhelming material superiority rather than tactical innovation, would be predictable and therefore defeatable by superior German fighting spirit. But the vehicle that had torn through his position represented something else entirely, not just material superiority, but a fundamentally different approach to warfare, one that valued speed and aggression over methodical preparation, one that accepted risk in exchange for tempo, one that trusted individual initiative over centralized control. This was not the American army of propaganda. This was something far more dangerous. The historical record of these vehicles' effectiveness is fragmentary, preserved primarily in after-action reports, unit histories, and the personal accounts of soldiers who served in or against them. Official U.S. Army documentation tends to focus on conventional armor operations, the exploits of Sherman tanks and tank destroyer battalions equipped with purpose-built vehicles like the M10 and M18. The field-modified gun trucks and weaponized reconnaissance vehicles operated in the gaps of official doctrine, often supported more by unit-level initiative than by formal institutional backing. But scattered through the archives are hints of their impact. A report from the 2nd Armored Division, dated January 1945, notes that modified M8 armored cars proved exceptionally valuable in rapid pursuit operations, capable of maintaining pressure on retreating enemy forces in circumstances where heavier armor could not keep pace. A captured German document, a report from a Wehrmacht intelligence officer attempting to classify new American weapons systems, describes encounters with fast-moving vehicles of uncertain type, apparently lightly armored but carrying disproportionate armament, employed in aggressive reconnaissance and harassment roles. The O.F. Weiser noted with obvious frustration that standard anti-tank doctrine proves inadequate against vehicles that do not remain in position long enough to engage effectively. Perhaps more telling are the accounts from German soldiers themselves, preserved in post-war interviews and memoirs. A Panzer Grenadier officer named Hauptmann Ernst Weber, who fought in the Ardennes and later in the defense of the Rhine, recalled his first encounter with what he identified as an American gun truck. "We were in position along a tree line, well concealed, with good fields of fire. We had 2 MG-42s and a PaK-40 anti-tank gun. We felt secure. Then suddenly, from our left flank, came this vehicle. I still cannot adequately describe it. It was not a tank, not properly an armored car, something in between. It was moving very fast, perhaps 50 kilometers per hour, and it seemed to have guns everywhere. Before we could properly react, it had raked our position, killing 3 men and destroying one of our machine guns. Our PaK-40 crew tried to traverse to engage, but before they could fire, the vehicle was gone. Simply gone. It appeared again 10 minutes later on our right flank and repeated the process. We abandoned the position. What else could we do? The psychological dimension of the Iron Wasp's effectiveness cannot be overstated. Modern military theory recognizes that the psychological impact of weapons often exceeds their purely physical destructive capacity. The German Stuka dive bomber's distinctive siren, for instance, was psychologically devastating far beyond the actual lethality of its bomb load. Similarly, the Soviet Katyusha rocket launcher, despite being less accurate than conventional artillery, terrorized German troops with its sudden, overwhelming barrages. The Iron Wasp achieved a similar effect through a combination of speed, unpredictability, and audacity. For German defenders already demoralized by the overwhelming material superiority of Allied forces, already exhausted by years of attritional warfare, the appearance of these vehicles represented yet another way the Americans could reach out and kill them with seeming impunity. They couldn't hide from them. The vehicles were too fast, appeared too suddenly. They couldn't fight them effectively. By the time defensive weapons were brought to bear, the vehicles had disengaged, and they couldn't predict where they would appear next. The cumulative effect was a sense of vulnerability, of being hunted, that corroded fighting effectiveness even when the vehicles themselves weren't present. The symbolic power of these vehicles extended beyond their tactical effectiveness. To the Americans who crewed them, the Iron Wasps represented the best of American military culture: improvisation, mechanical ingenuity, aggressive action, and trust in individual initiative. The vehicles were often personalized, given names and nose art like bombers, decorated with kill markings and unit insignia. Crews developed intense pride in their vehicles and their unconventional role. They saw themselves as cavalrymen in the tradition of Jeb Stuart or Phil Sheridan, as mounted raiders striking deep into enemy territory, living by speed and audacity rather than armor plate and overwhelming force. This self-image was reinforced by the fact that many crews did indeed operate far ahead of main American lines, conducting reconnaissance by fire, cutting German communications, ambushing supply columns, and generally creating chaos in German rear areas. One particularly well-documented example comes from the U.S. Third Army's drive across France in the late summer of 1944. A platoon of modified M8 armored cars attached to the 6th Armored Division, operating under the informal designation Task Force Razor, conducted what amounted to an independent cavalry raid deep into German-held territory. Over a period of 3 days, the force of just 6 vehicles covered over 200 miles, destroying or capturing numerous supply trucks, cutting telephone lines, attacking command posts, and generally creating the impression of a much larger American penetration. German units diverted to respond to these incursions found themselves chasing ghosts. By the time they arrived at the reported location, Task Force Razor had moved on. The psychological effect was profound. German commanders became convinced that American armor had achieved a breakthrough far deeper than was actually the case, leading to premature withdrawals from otherwise defensible positions. The entire operation cost the Americans 2 vehicles lost to mechanical breakdown and 0 combat casualties, while tying down German forces and creating confusion that directly contributed to the rapid collapse of German defenses in that sector. For the Germans, conversely, the Iron Wasp symbolized everything about the American way of war that they found both alien and deeply threatening. German military doctrine emphasized careful planning, methodical execution, adherence to proper procedure, and the primacy of operational art over tactical opportunism. The idea of sending lightly armored vehicles racing deep into enemy territory without proper support, relying on speed and firepower to compensate for vulnerability, struck German officers as reckless to the point of incompetence. Yet it worked. Time and again it worked. And the fact that it worked despite violating every principle of proper military doctrine made it all the more demoralizing. It suggested that perhaps German military science, for all its sophistication and theoretical rigor, had missed something fundamental about modern warfare. It suggested that the Americans, with their pragmatic disregard for theory and their willingness to simply try things and see what worked, had found an approach that German doctrine had no answer for. The material abundance that made the Iron Wasp possible was itself a form of psychological warfare. The vehicles were expendable in a way that German equipment simply wasn't. If an M8 was lost, another could be pulled from depot stocks or shipped from the United States within weeks. Crews knew this. They could afford to take risks, to push vehicles to their mechanical limits, to employ tactics that might result in losses, because the system that supported them could absorb those losses and replace them. German crews operating equipment that was increasingly irreplaceable, that required components no longer in production, that broke down and couldn't be repaired for lack of spare parts, had no such luxury. Every vehicle had to be husbanded, every risk carefully calculated, because losses were essentially permanent. This fundamental asymmetry in material circumstances created a corresponding asymmetry in tactical behavior. American crews could be aggressive because they could afford to be. German crews had to be cautious because they had no choice. And in a fluid, fast-moving campaign like the pursuit across Western Europe, aggression defeated caution almost every time. The evolution of German tactical responses to the Iron Wasp threat reveals the degree to which these vehicles disrupted established defensive doctrine. Initial responses were ad hoc and largely ineffective. Individual soldiers were instructed to engage the vehicles with Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons, but the short-range and single-shot nature of the Panzerfaust made it nearly useless against targets moving at high speed. Anti-tank gun crews were ordered to maintain constant vigilance and to engage any targets of opportunity immediately, but the Iron Wasps rarely presented themselves as targets long enough for gun crews to properly aim and fire. Some German units attempted to create ambush positions, concentrating anti-tank weapons along likely approach routes, but the unpredictability of the vehicles' movements and their ability to operate across rough terrain made such ambushes difficult to position effectively. By early 1945, German defensive instructions had evolved to include specific guidance on countering fast-moving American gun vehicles. These instructions, preserved in captured documents, are revealing both for what they recommend and for the tone of frustration that permeates them. Units were instructed to maintain all-around security at all times, to position anti-tank weapons with overlapping fields of fire covering all potential approaches, to establish early warning systems using outposts and observers, and to respond to any sighting of such vehicles with immediate concentrated fire from all available weapons. Notably, the instructions emphasize that these vehicles must be engaged immediately upon appearance, and that hesitation will result in loss of opportunity to engage effectively. The guidance essentially required German units to remain in a constant state of high alert, diverting attention and resources from other defensive priorities, all to counter a threat that might or might not actually materialize at any given position. The psychological and physical toll of maintaining such vigilance was considerable and represented a strategic victory for the Iron Wasps even in the absence of direct engagement. The technical specifications of these vehicles, while impressive, tell only part of the story. A modified M8 mounting multiple 50 caliber machine guns could theoretically lay down approximately 2,000 rounds per minute of heavy machine gun fire, enough to literally saw through light structures and suppress any infantry position within range. The 50 caliber Browning M2, firing armor-piercing incendiary ammunition, was capable of penetrating the side armor of German half-tracks and light armored vehicles at practical combat ranges. More heavily modified vehicles mounting 75 or larger guns could engage hardened positions, bunkers, and even the rear armor of German tanks. But the true weapon was not the guns themselves, but the platform that carried them, the ability to bring devastating firepower to bear exactly where and when it was needed, and then to disengage before the enemy could respond effectively. The crews who operated these vehicles were a self-selected group of volunteers and enthusiasts who understood the risks and embraced them. Operating an Iron Wasp required a particular temperament: aggressive, confident, comfortable with high-speed maneuver in combat conditions, and possessed of the mechanical aptitude to keep temperamental modified vehicles running under field conditions. Crews were typically small, usually 3 to 4 men, fostering a sense of intimacy and mutual dependence that strengthened unit cohesion. Many crews gave their vehicles individual names and developed superstitious rituals around their operation. One crew operating in Germany in March 1945 named their vehicle Stinger and insisted on touching a St. Christopher medal welded to the dashboard before every mission. Another crew, operating a vehicle they called Banshee, painted kill markings on the hull for every German vehicle destroyed or disabled, eventually accumulating 23 marks before the war's end. These personal touches, these assertions of individual identity within the military machine, were themselves deeply American cultural expressions. The insistence on personal agency and individual distinction, even within a hierarchical organization. The logistical trail that sustained these vehicles tells another important part of the story. Each Iron Wasp required prodigious amounts of ammunition, thousands of rounds of 50 caliber ammunition, hundreds of rounds of larger caliber ammunition if so equipped, plus fuel, spare parts, and maintenance support. The American logistics system, the so-called Red Ball Express and its successor operations, was capable of delivering these supplies to forward units with a reliability that German forces could only envy. German soldiers, by 1945, were often reduced to scavenging ammunition from the dead and drawing fuel allocations measured in liters rather than drums. American crews, by contrast, could expend ammunition with relative freedom, knowing that resupply would arrive on schedule. This fundamental asymmetry in logistics translated directly into combat effectiveness. An Iron Wasp crew that didn't have to conserve ammunition could engage targets more freely, could conduct longer suppressive fire missions, could afford to fire speculatively at suspected enemy positions. The economic and industrial capacity of the United States, channeled through the logistics apparatus of the U.S. Army, manifested on the battlefield as an apparent infinity of resources that allowed tactical freedoms German forces simply didn't possess. The sound of the Iron Wasp became its signature, its calling card that announced its presence even before it could be seen. The high-pitched whine of the Hercules engine operating at maximum RPM, the mechanical scream of steel machinery pushed to its limits, combined with the distinctive hammering of 50 caliber machine guns to create an acoustic signature that German soldiers learned to recognize and fear. Unlike the deep rumble of tank engines or the growl of truck motors, the Iron Wasp sound was sharp, urgent, aggressive, a mechanical wasp indeed, its anger audible and approaching fast. Veterans reported being able to distinguish the sound from all other battlefield noise, and to experience an involuntary spike of adrenaline and fear upon hearing it. This Pavlovian response, the learned association between a specific sound and imminent danger, contributed significantly to the vehicle's psychological impact. Even when the vehicles weren't present, any similar sound, a racing truck engine, a distant motorcycle, could trigger the same fear response in German soldiers who had experienced attacks by these vehicles. The broader strategic impact of the Iron Wasp phenomenon extended beyond individual engagements. The presence of these vehicles influenced German operational planning, forced the allocation of resources to counter them, and contributed to the general sense among German forces that they were fighting an enemy who possessed not just material superiority, but a fundamental adaptability and innovative capacity that German forces couldn't match. Every novel American weapons system, every tactical innovation, reinforced the narrative that the United States possessed virtually unlimited capacity for invention and production, that whatever the Germans might do, the Americans would respond with something new, something unexpected, something that rendered previous defensive measures obsolete. This perception of American military-industrial invincibility became a self-fulfilling prophecy. German soldiers who believed they were fighting an unbeatable enemy often fought less effectively than their tactical situation might otherwise warrant. The contrast between German and American approaches to military technology and tactics represented fundamentally different national philosophies. German military culture valued precision engineering, theoretical sophistication, and adherence to doctrine developed through careful study. The German military produced superbly engineered weapons systems, the Tiger and Panther tanks, the MG-42 machine gun, the Messerschmitt fighters, that were marvels of engineering. But they were also complex, expensive, difficult to produce in large numbers, and often temperamental under field conditions. The German approach prioritized quality over quantity, sophistication over simplicity, theoretical perfection over pragmatic effectiveness. The American approach, embodied in weapons like the Iron Wasp, was exactly the opposite. Take a simple, reliable platform, modify it in the field to meet immediate tactical needs. Don't worry about doctrinal purity or theoretical elegance. If it works, use it. If it doesn't, try something else. This pragmatic empiricism, this willingness to experiment and iterate rapidly based on combat feedback, gave American forces a flexibility and adaptability that more rigid German doctrine couldn't match. By the spring of 1945, as Allied forces drove deeper into Germany itself, the Iron Wasps and their kin had become routine elements of American combat operations. They ranged ahead of advancing columns, probing for resistance, engaging targets of opportunity, creating the chaos and confusion that characterized the final collapse of German military resistance in the West. German defenders, now fighting on their own territory, should theoretically have possessed advantages: knowledge of terrain, shorter supply lines, the motivation of defending their homeland. But these advantages were negated by the speed and aggression of American advances that the Iron Wasps both enabled and symbolized. There was no time to establish defensive positions before they were flanked or overrun. There was no position safe from the sudden appearance of fast-moving gun vehicles that could strike and vanish before effective response was possible. The German army in the West didn't so much retreat as dissolve, unit cohesion breaking down, as soldiers individually concluded that continued resistance was futile, and that survival required surrender or flight. The personal transformation of soldiers like Klaus Becker, the young grenadier who had crouched in his foxhole in the Ardennes and watched an Iron Wasp tear through his position, represents the human dimension of this technological and tactical evolution. Klaus had been educated in a system that taught German superiority, that assured him of the inevitable triumph of German arms, that portrayed the enemy as weak and contemptible. Every encounter with American forces chipped away at that certainty. The Iron Wasp was simply the most visceral, most immediate challenge to the worldview he had been taught to accept. It demonstrated with mechanical clarity that the Americans were not soft, not incompetent, not inferior. They were innovative, aggressive, and possessed of resources so vast that they could afford to experiment, to take risks, to throw away entire vehicle designs if they didn't work and try something else. Klaus survived the war. He surrendered to American forces in April 1945, part of the mass capitulation that characterized the final weeks of the conflict in Europe. In interviews conducted decades later, he spoke of that first encounter with the Iron Wasp as the moment he began to understand that Germany would lose the war. Not because of that single vehicle, but because of what it represented, an enemy who would keep coming, keep innovating, keep overwhelming German resistance with new weapons and new tactics faster than Germany could possibly respond. The technical designation Iron Wasp, or Eisenwesp, was never an official Wehrmacht classification. It was soldiers' slang, the kind of informal nomenclature that arises from shared experience and shared fear. But its adoption and spread through German units suggests the degree to which these vehicles captured the imagination and anxiety of German soldiers. The wasp metaphor was apt in multiple ways. Wasps are fast, aggressive, unpredictable in their movements. They can appear anywhere. They strike suddenly and painfully, and they often attack in groups, overwhelming defenders through numbers and persistence. All of these characteristics applied to the American gun vehicles that the name described. The iron prefix added a dimension of industrial menace, the sense of being attacked not just by soldiers, but by machines, by the products of an industrial system so vast that it could churn out these killing machines in apparently unlimited numbers. In the final accounting, the Iron Wasp and the class of vehicles it represented were not war-winning weapons in the direct sense. They did not turn the tide of battles, did not enable strategic breakthroughs that would otherwise have been impossible, did not inflict casualties on a scale that significantly altered the balance of forces. What they did was accelerate and intensify the process by which American tactical and operational superiority translated into strategic victory. They were force multipliers that allowed American units to move faster, hit harder, and operate more aggressively than German forces could counter. They contributed to the psychological disintegration of German resistance by demonstrating, engagement by engagement, that German forces had no answer to American innovation and American abundance. And they embodied in steel and speed and firepower a distinctly American approach to warfare, pragmatic, innovative, aggressive, and supported by an industrial base so powerful that it could afford to be wasteful in pursuit of effectiveness. The vehicles themselves mostly didn't survive the transition to peacetime. The modified gun trucks and weaponized armored cars were decommissioned, scrapped, or sold off as surplus. They had been expedients, solutions to immediate tactical problems, not permanent additions to the force structure. The doctrine they represented, however, the emphasis on speed and firepower, on aggressive action, on mobile warfare conducted by relatively small units operating with considerable autonomy, survived and evolved. The mechanized cavalry tradition they embodied would find expression in later conflicts, in the helicopter cavalry units of Vietnam, in the wheeled armored vehicles of modern expeditionary forces, in every weapon system that prioritizes speed and hitting power over armor protection. The Iron Wasp was not an endpoint, but a beginning, a proof of concept that aggressive, highly mobile, heavily armed light forces could achieve disproportionate effects against heavier, but less mobile opponents. For the men who faced them, though, the Iron Wasps remained vivid memories decades after the war ended. In reunions of Wehrmacht veterans, In memoirs and interviews, the vehicles appeared again and again as symbols of the overwhelming material and tactical superiority of Allied forces. German veterans spoke of them with a mixture of professional respect and lingering unease, recognizing their effectiveness while still, on some level, being disturbed by the audacity and ruthlessness of their employment. This was not the way war was supposed to be conducted, according to the doctrine they had learned. Battles were supposed to be methodical affairs, with clear front lines, with time to prepare positions and organize fires. The Iron Wasps represented something else, something faster and more chaotic, something that didn't respect the rules of proper military engagement. They were harbingers of a new kind of warfare, one where speed and surprise trumped careful planning, where material abundance enabled tactical risk-taking, where the old certainties of military science gave way to pragmatic improvisation. On a muddy road somewhere in western Germany, in late April 1945, an American sergeant named Tom Mitchell sat in the commander's position of a modified M8 armored car, watching columns of German soldiers trudging into captivity. His vehicle, which his crew had christened Hellcat Roman II, after its predecessor had broken down in France, had been racing across Germany for 3 weeks, part of the headlong rush that characterized the final American advance. They had covered hundreds of miles, engaged dozens of targets, and survived without a scratch through a combination of speed, luck, and aggressive action. Mitchell didn't think of his vehicle as an Iron Wasp. He'd never heard the German nickname, but he understood what it represented. It was American ingenuity, American mechanical skill, American willingness to try new things. It was the product of a system that encouraged innovation, that trusted junior leaders to improvise solutions to problems, that possessed the industrial capacity to support experimentation and the willingness to accept that not every experiment would succeed. As he watched the defeated German soldiers trudge past, Mitchell felt not triumph, but a kind of weary satisfaction. They had done what they'd been asked to do. They had taken a reconnaissance vehicle and turned it into a weapon of pursuit and harassment. They had pushed it to its limits and beyond, had operated far ahead of friendly forces, had struck at the enemy when and where it hurt most. And they had survived. In a few weeks, he'd be going home, back to a country that had never experienced bombardment or occupation, back to a civilian life in a nation whose industry hadn't been destroyed, whose cities still stood, whose future wasn't buried under rubble and defeat. The vehicle that had carried him through the war would be scrapped or sold off, forgotten by everyone except the men who had crewed it and the men who had faced it. But the idea it represented, that speed and firepower and audacity could overcome material disadvantages, that innovation mattered as much as planning, that war was ultimately won not just by the side with better weapons, but by the side that could adapt faster and improvise better. That idea would endure. The Iron Wasp's legacy lies not in the vehicles themselves, but in the philosophy they embodied and the psychological impact they achieved. They were symbols of American industrial might and tactical flexibility made manifest in steel and speed. They demonstrated that warfare was evolving, that the static doctrines developed in previous conflicts were giving way to something more fluid and faster-paced, something that rewarded initiative and punished rigidity. For the Americans who crewed them, they were expressions of confidence and aggression, vehicles that allowed them to take the fight to the enemy on their own terms. For the Germans who faced them, they were harbingers of defeat, mechanical wasps whose sting represented not just immediate danger, but the larger truth that Germany was facing an enemy who could not be defeated by conventional means. In the end, the Iron Wasp was more than a weapon. It was a statement about American capacity for innovation, about the power of industrial abundance translated into tactical effectiveness, about the value of aggressive action and calculated risk. It was a statement written in the screaming of overstressed engines and the hammering of heavy machine guns, written on German defensive positions torn apart in seconds, written in the fear and respect of soldiers who faced it. It was a statement that speed and surprise and overwhelming firepower, delivered at the right place and the right time, could achieve victories that no amount of careful planning and methodical execution could match. It was a statement that the old rules no longer applied, that a new kind of warfare had arrived, one where the future belonged to those who could innovate fastest and adapt most thoroughly. And in the foxholes and bunkers, where German soldiers crouched and listened for the distinctive mechanical scream that signaled the Iron Wasp's approach, that statement was heard clearly and understood completely. The Americans were not just winning through material superiority. They were winning because they were better at learning, better at adapting, better at creating new solutions to old problems. The Iron Wasp was merely one example among many, but it was a particularly vivid one, a particularly memorable one, a particularly terrifying one. It haunted German defensive positions and German dreams alike, a mechanical ghost that could appear anywhere, strike suddenly, and vanish before effective response was possible. It was the sound of inevitability, the howl of approaching defeat given mechanical form and aggressive purpose. In the final weeks of the war in Europe, as German resistance collapsed and Allied forces overran what remained of the Third Reich, the Iron Wasps continued their work, ranging ahead of advancing forces, mopping up scattered resistance, cutting off retreat routes, and creating the chaos that accelerated disintegration. They were present at the end, witnesses to the final collapse of a military machine that had once seemed invincible. And when victory came, when the guns finally fell silent and the shooting stopped, the Iron Wasps and their crews could claim their share of credit for the speed and completeness of that victory. They had been one tool among many in the arsenal of Allied power, but they had been an effective tool, a feared tool, a tool that had accomplished its purpose and justified the innovative thinking that had created it. The mechanical wasp had stung, again and again, until its enemy could no longer fight back. And in that simple fact lay a truth about warfare, about innovation, about the power of combining technical capacity with tactical audacity. The Iron Wasp proved that speed could substitute for armor, that surprise could compensate for vulnerability, that aggressive action could achieve what cautious defense could not. It proved that war was not a science with fixed rules, but an art that rewarded creativity and punished rigidity. And it proved, once again, that victory belonged not just to the strong or the brave or the well-prepared, but to those who could adapt fastest to changing circumstances and turn their resources, however unconventional, into effective weapons. The Wasp may have been made of iron, but its sting was real, and the fear it inspired was genuine. That fear, as much as the physical destruction the vehicles inflicted, contributed to Allied victory. And that fear outlasted the war itself, preserved in memoirs and nightmares, a testament to the power of innovation and the enduring impact of weapons that strike not just at the body, but at the mind, not just at positions, but at morale, not just at armies, but at the will to resist. The Iron Wasp haunted German lines, and then it haunted German memories, a mechanical ghost that symbolized everything about American military power that German military doctrine had no answer for. Fast as a jeep, armed like a tank, and possessed of an audacity that made it more than the sum of its parts, that was the Iron Wasp, the vehicle that helped break the Wehrmacht's will and accelerate the end of the Third Reich's dark reign.